Hola, comrades. Today's topic of interest, Mega Man. I've talked before on this channel, most notably on my video about Sonic the Hedgehog, about the irrelevance that awaits series which stagnate. Chasing the past earns the franchise acclaim from critics, many of whom were teenagers when the franchise was in its heyday, and from longtime hardcore fans, but it does nothing to revitalize the franchise for the enjoyment of the next generation. This trap has foiled far more franchises than the average gamer would realize, because these franchises have faded into oblivion. There is one franchise, however, that has not yet receded from popular consciousness, but stands as a sobering reminder of how quickly and drastically a franchise's star can fade when it fails to innovate and keep up with the expectations of a gaming public with exponentially increasing standards for gameplay and storytelling and characterization. That franchise is Mega Man. For all intents and purposes, this franchise is dead, or at least on life support. Yes, there's a Mega Man 11 scheduled to release at the end of the year, but it hasn't exactly attracted a lot of buzz outside the hardcore Mega Man fanbase. I didn't even know it existed until I began doing research for this video. True, this was never the biggest franchise in the world. It never reached the heights of Mario or Sonic or Zelda or Metroid. There's a subsection of older gaming fans who swear by this series, but I don't even know how many of them would say this is their absolute favorite franchise. I don't know how many of them would say this franchise changed their lives. And you can see why it never made that sort of profound cultural impression. Early Mario, Zelda, Sonic, and Metroid were flush with imagination. They transported players into these fantastic, intricately crafted worlds and let them explore to their heart's content. There were secrets to be found and tricks to be tested. Mega Man just wasn't like that, and not because the games were so frustratingly difficult. They were about a blue robot stopping other robots and defeating an evil doctor. That's about as stereotypical as you can get. There's nothing wacky or eyebrow-raising about that. More importantly, they didn't flesh out the world. Zelda and Metroid didn't have major gimmicks either, but what they did have was fantastic world building. When you think of Zelda, a certain picture pops into your head. Great fields, sprawling landscapes, diverse in flavor and culture. There's magic and mystery and surprisingly heartfelt character moments, and there's a sense that there's always something to uncover. When you think of Mario, you think of comedy, and color, and optimism, and vivid, beautiful worlds. When you think of Sonic, you think of that, but a bit more urbanized, a bit less fantastic, and with a bit more 90s snark and irony thrown in. When you think of Metroid, you think of isolation, creeping dread, sci-fi horror straight out of the Alien series, the existential emptiness of being alone with no one to turn to. But what do you think of when you think of Mega Man besides the difficulty and the individual gameplay dynamics? What does the series sum to as a whole? What's its artistic essence? Not much. That does not mean the early Mega Man games weren't masterpieces of platforming. They were, but the series was at a disadvantage when it came to transitioning into the late 90s and the 2000s, and it did not fare well. How did this series transition into 3D, you may ask? Mario handled the transition well, Sonic less well, but both those franchises managed it, which is why they're still big names today. Mega Man did not manage that transition. It did not even try. Why would it? The core of this series hadn't changed since the first game, even after 8 mainline entries. May I remind you that 8 games into the Zelda series, it had gone from the NES to the SNES and the Game Boy and the N64. This does not mean the Mega Man franchise shut down. Far from it. Rather than producing mainline games, the series took to the last refuge of franchises that have no ideas but are looking for cheap cash-ins. It made spin-offs, and it made unimaginative sequels to those spin-offs. Mega Man pumped out these games like mad all the way through the end of the 2000s. They didn't make gobs of money, but that was no matter. They were cheap enough to make, so Capcom could continue to mass produce them like crazy. There was a profusion of them, from the Mega Man X series to the Mega Man Zero series to the Mega Man Battle Network series. All of these series were at least slightly different from the original Mega Man series, I'll give them that. What they weren't was good, or interesting, or memorable. Their ubiquity exacerbated the decline of the series. When the string of spin-offs ran dry, Capcom looked for where to push the series next, and they sought to take it back to its roots. This was a bad call. It can be tempting to return to what worked in the past when working with a franchise that has been slammed both critically and commercially, but this is an impulse that must be avoided. Mega Man 9 and Mega Man 10 were solid games, some of the best in the series, but they only earned laurels from inside the gaming sphere and from long-time fans. They benefited the Mega Man series about as much as Sonic Mania has helped the Sonic series, that is to say, not very much. Much of the blame for Mega Man's decline has gone to Capcom, but I don't think that's entirely fair. I'm certainly not going to defend Capcom, of course. I've never liked the company, and I've never respected it either. But as a critic and an analyst, it's my duty to point out that they are not entirely at fault here. Look at how Nintendo has treated some of its franchises. Zelda and Mario get top billing, while older franchises like F-Zero and Metroid are pushed out of the way for newer ones like Pikmin and Splatoon. Capcom has admittedly not been the smartest with their use of Mega Man, but they certainly haven't tried to sabotage him, as the critics have proclaimed. The reason they haven't used the character in games as of late is tediously capitalistic. There's simply not a lot of demand out there for Mega Man outside the hardcore fandom. The series didn't try to stay ahead of the curve, and so it fell behind. What place is there in a modern gaming landscape for Mega Man? Just the name of the character sounds bland. It sounds like the name of some protagonist of a bad Saturday morning cartoon show. And it is to the detriment of the franchise that the landscape has divided itself into games with cartoonish visual stylings and games with realistic visual stylings, because Mega Man is in between. He's a semi-cutesy humanoid robot, too adorable for the Metal Gear Solid crowd, too realistic for the Mario and Sonic crowd. However, despite these limitations, the series could have risen back to the top of the gaming landscape, or at least remained prominent, if the developers had figured out how to take it into the 21st century. Perhaps Mega Man 11 will launch the series back into the gaming mainstream, but I doubt it. There's simply not a large market for this franchise anymore. If nothing else, the Sonic franchise at least keeps finding new and inspired ways to fail. Mega Man keeps reskinning the same basic game formula, and the people got bored a long time ago. The most Mega Man can offer us in the modern age is a cautionary tale of the importance of innovation. In the early days of gaming, this was one of the most important franchises out there, but now it's an afterthought at best. It's only the fourth best-selling franchise in the history of Capcom, behind Resident Evil, Monster Hunter, and Street Fighter, and it's only one spot ahead of Devil May Cry. It's had a good run, and it helped shape the history of an entire genre of gaming. But unless Capcom does something really radical, like contracting Mega Man 11 out to Monolith Soft, the team behind Xenoblade Chronicles, as well as Nintendo's recent renaissance, it will be best for the franchise if it is laid down to rest for good. The alternative is to string it out through several more embarrassing, unimaginative entries until it is absolutely clear that it has nothing to offer. In biology, we have a saying, adapt or die. Either an organism adapts to its changing environment, or it becomes extinct. Let Mega Man teach us how to handle situations in which a once popular franchise has stagnated. The temptation is to return to the series' origins, but this can only generate temporary relief. For a franchise to move forward, to truly advance, it needs to innovate. It needs to make itself relevant to the modern gamer. This is a risk, yes, and sometimes it can backfire horribly, but the choice is this. Either the developers can go out on a crazy gamble in an attempt to revive the franchise, or they can do nothing and doom their series to an early demise. It's always enjoyable to tackle a series I haven't analyzed on this channel thus far. I've done enough videos on Mario and Zelda and Pokémon. I thought it would be interesting to examine a franchise that's perhaps not as well known anymore. Gaming, more than any other medium, is based on the idea of the series, not the individual entry. A company does not release a bunch of radically different games every year. They release a small collection of risky original games, backed up by blockbuster entries in several dependable franchises. If the risky games flop, that's okay. The company still earns a lot of revenue. And if the risky games are unexpected smashes, all the better. More sequels can be made. This ethos is so prevalent throughout the AAA gaming landscape that we tend to exaggerate it and assume that every franchise that was big then is still big now. But that's not the case, and I wanted to highlight that in this episode. Anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more stagnation-free content. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that innovative stuff. Adios, comrades!